Rocket. With my kids. Yeah, the kids. Oh.
I don't know, you made a rent for speed rates, she's got like this, like marshmallows. Yeah. We can all move up.
The back row is the new front row.
Oh, yeah. We don't have to go all the way to the entire.
All right. This party started? Yeah. Mom.
That's why they can change. They're like, you haven't heard of mommy. I realized, and I saw them trying to pick her up. I'm like, this whole time, you know, okay, sorry. I was like,
Really,
I was like, I don't know. My father did. And they don't have to answer. Okay, and I from Toronto, they wanted to use this. I'm like, you know. Okay. What's your like research on that?
Don't take it as such a flat.
I'm not getting.
We're essentially just resources for them. That's all
You're
we
gonna answer switch to like. No, I can use my.
You too, you don't need one of them.
Essentially you're being.
Ryan, we're ready to go?
You know it?
Okay. How many we have online? Hi, online. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our talk this afternoon. It's a real honor to have Alan Luss here from the University of Gothenburg with us. And before I talk about Professor Luss' biography and her talk today, I just want to remind you tomorrow at 1 p.m. We have another talk at the Center for Governance and Markets with Sharif Azami, who was formerly of the Fetzer Institute, and he's talking about toxic polarization in the United States. And he is an Afghan American who has been in the United States for about 15 years. And his father was assassinated by the Taliban. And he works on bridging divides here in the United States. So it's very interesting person, very provocative. His talk will certainly be, so if you're interested in these issues of bridging, please come and join us for that talk. Yes.
3 p.m.
3 p.m. and 3911. Okay, impossible. So you won't have to come to cold. And there'll be coffee there. Okay. So today we have Professor Alan Luss from the University of Gothenburg joining us, and she will be giving a talk, Everyday Choices, the Role of Competing Authorities and Social Institutions in Politics and Development. And this talk is based on a very exciting new book she has coming out at the end of the year. Some of it's coming out at the end of the year, the Cambridge University Press. And that book will be open source, so it will be available to download for everyone for free. So make sure that you check it out when it comes out. Professor Luss is the founding director of the Governance and Local Development Institute at the Center for Governance and Markets, which began its life as a research center at Yale University before it moved to the University of Gothenburg, which is in Sweden, which is a lovely place. She has conducted field work and implemented surveys in Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Kenya, Libya, Malawi, Morocco, Palestine, Syria, Tunisia, and Zambia. This book project is her new forthcoming book. Her current research examines the role of social institutions and local authorities in governance. And she's also leading her center's work on the development of a tool to systematically gauge subnational variations in governance. So this is the Local Governance Performance Index, which is a real labor of love. And for any of you who are interested in governance, measuring governance, I'm sure we could spend some time talking about that as well. So in addition to her impressive academic work, she's the co-founder of the Transitional Governance Project, a founding associate editor of Middle East Law and Governance, and has served as an advisor and consultant to organizations like the Carter Center, Freedom House, the National Democratic Institute, UNICEF, UN, USAID, and the World Bank. and many, many others. So without further ado, Professor Luss, the floor is yours. It's a real honor to have you.
Otherwise known as Ellen. But thank you for that very kind introduction. So basically, let me tell you my goals today to make you all, and I know your goals that you're in class, so that's good. But my goal is that I want first to, kind of present this framework and have a discussion about it. But also because this framework is really the basis of the future work I'm doing. So I'm really interested in feedback, not just, okay, this is a book, sometimes you finish something, you feel like you need to get the message out there, but you really, you're done, you're past it. This really is the basis of what we're doing moving forward. And so I'm really interested to hear, your thoughts, your critiques, your what ifs, and buts regarding it. And the other thing is that a lot of the things we do are very collaborative. So if these things are, and I'll talk about future projects at the end of this, but if they are, areas of interest to you, if you're working on projects that are, that touch on these, then please let me know, because one of the things I'm doing is essentially also looking for playmates, so like playmates. Let's see if I can do it this way. Okay. So yeah, so today what I want to do first is I want to present this framework that comes out in the Everyday Choices and the book that we just talked about. It's a very short book, so here's the things that you should like about it. It's 60 pages, so you can say I read a book today, and you can actually takes you an hour. It's open access. I just saw on because I was told that Amazon said it was coming out November 25th, and so I was like, oh, this is interesting. So I went on to Amazon. They're trying to sell it to you for $22, but I would suggest not paying the $22, just downloading it from Cambridge. I want to illustrate it using some of the previous work that is in the book and that I talk about there, but also some of the current research, so you can get some of kind of points that are maybe not covered as closely in the book itself. And then again, I want to sort of discuss the future research and projects that we're doing. So stepping back for a little bit and thinking just about what we often see happening around us, right? So this is a picture of voters who are lined up to go voting in the Cairo elections in Egypt, and in 2020. And basically, in kind of an ideal world, at least as many people see it, we would think of these as being voters who are like lining up, in the best of worlds to decide who is going to represent their interests and make policies and implement them, etc. Right? That's one way of understanding what they're doing. But if you talk to them, or if you sort of look at polls and all of the information we know about them, in addition to it being a case where you say, okay, well, how much are people, representatives really making, decisions and implementing policies in a place like, Egypt. But we also find that there's a lot of other things that they're interested in, right? They feel an obligation to sort of demonstrate their piety, or they feel an obligation to vote for somebody who, sort of represents their family or their tribe or their kin interests, or because they need to demonstrate their loyalty to a certain set of groups or others. In other words, that what they're doing, if you think about them and going to the ballot box, is not simply casting a ballot for a representative in the political sphere, but also, doing acts that are really fundamentally about loyalty to some groups, or, demonstrating kind of their identity or their piety, or following the rules of other groups. I'll talk a lot about places like Egypt today, but I just want to flag the fact that, and I talk about this in the book as well, that this is nothing particular to the global South or places like that, or, that sort of anything that's really different. If we looked at even the last elections and we looked around the US, for instance, we find that, often people see their voting choice being driven very heavily by, who their clergy say is the right person to vote for. And they're doing it because they believe that this is actually right from a religious point of view, not necessarily right from the point of view of the policy that they think would be enacted with those people put into office, right? And even if you don't see them necessarily sort of following the vote, then sort of the interesting thing about the sort of the sign, the voting sign out here in the yard signs, is that we do have some pretty good evidence that often people in neighborhoods where they may not agree with everybody around them are very reticent to put up yard signs that demonstrate the sort of the fact that they don't necessarily agree with everyone around them. And again, that's not because they don't want to put up the yard sign, it's because they don't want to actually sort of in a sense kind of buck the norms and act differently than the sort of neighborhood. So we know these things, right? We know that people may vote for other reasons. We know that if you were going to a public institution or you're going to a bureaucratic office, that sometimes people are favored over others, not necessarily because they should be, but because of some other sets of connections, etc. But we talk about these things like corruption. We talk about them in terms of clientelism, in terms of lack of accountability, of nepotism, tradition. So we have a lot of words that we use to describe these that somehow otherize this, right? So there's the sort of the state and institutions and the right way that things should be done, and then there's these other things that are kind of residual and almost disruptive in their nature. That's and so they're much less well specified. And even if we're talking about things like, research on religion and politics and others, there's not as much specificity. So we step back and we think about what the literature has tended to do. And I'm going to kind of give you categories and what I see as subsets of literature. I mean, one can dispute things and say, well, does this piece belong here or there? But just more generally, I think there's a lot of it which is very state-centric, right? In which the state dominates, and then everything else, as I was just mentioning, is sort of seen as residual, right? And I would argue, at least in political science and a lot of the policy and development world, is the kind of the majority or the bulk of the literature, right? So, the state has institutions, we care about centralization or decentralization, majoritarian PR rules, etc. But when it comes to other things, they're just kind of this vague residual. We think of them as, times when we want to say, okay, what's the relationship between religion and politics, or what's the relationship between, identity and ethnicity and politics. But then we've chosen a priori what is the sort of the other category that we want to juxtapose. And then we again see the sort of the disruption or the failure to follow what should be from state institutions as some kind of a corruption or weak state. There's a second set of literature, which I think goes into more detail about sort of the nature of social institutions, right? And that literature, on the one hand, was also rather vague and talks about social institutions as being non-state ones. It equates social institutions and informal institutions, right? So if you think about somebody like Helmke and Levitsky's work, it's very influential and very important, but it really sort of, it doesn't necessarily specify them. And then there's a second set of literature within the sphere, which does think more about actual institutional rules. So if we think about literature that's on lineage systems, matrilineal and patrilineal systems, a lot of it thinking about the economic consequences of it. Some more recent work that thinks about the social political consequences of it. But they really are thinking about one set of institutional rules, and then what impact can that have? But generally, it's still very difficult to sort of think about how do we compare what we're seeing in the work on lineage and the work on, say, religion and politics. How do we really understand what an institution is, particularly given that the many definitions that are out there and really kind of aggregating knowledge. And then there's a third sort of literature, which is about, and I call this one literature, but it's really sort of two at least, and that's hybridity and intersectionality. And this literature in many ways does things that are more close to what I'm trying to do by recognizing that people are, engaged in multiple spheres, that there's a lot of influences on them, that they have, essentially kind of multiple sort of roles or hats that they wear. But they're often leaving it kind of there. They're not necessarily trying to come up with a way in which we can still compare against across very different types of places or very different sets of outcomes even, or sets of context. So, and partly because if you read their work, a lot of them don't actually, that's not an aim, right? Many of them are sort of almost anti-positive. If I'm a positivist, you'll see that. But don't necessarily see that as a goal that they're trying to achieve. So the fact that they don't achieve it is not really a great surprise, right? So again, the problems that I think that we face are, one is that we often assume rather than interrogate what sets of institutions and actors are really salient, that we overlook then the kinds of distinctions. I mean, there's a lot of work that sort of shows that context matters, right? And we've gotten, sort of, I had this cheeky line in the book that I was told to kind of tone down, that it basically sort of said, after millions of dollars and thousands of hours of effort, most that we know from most RCTs is that what works in one place doesn't work in another, and we're like, oh, that's because of context. But what about context mattered gets sort of kind of elided. And that's, and again, it's not a problem just in terms of theory, it is a problem that really the fact that we can't sort of aggregate this knowledge and we can't understand what's taking place, either from a programmatic point perspective, if we're trying to implement policies and programs, or from a theoretical perspective. In fact, one of the things that I also, think is really important is because we do this, we will often assume that factors and sort of consequences are the consequences of state institutions rather than the other sets of institutions that are around them. So the goal today then is first to sort of positive framework where we basically sort of think about everyday choices, the very choices that individuals make as being the basis for understanding how we get different sets of politics and outcomes. It takes then as a sort of basis the idea that individuals are members of multiple communities, right? And that when they're then making choices over what who to vote for, who to serve, et cetera, they're doing so in the context of recognizing that these different communities can make different claims on them, right? They can essentially give them to there's different obligations and different sort of results are expected with them. And what I want to do then is say, let's not privilege the state. Let's not say the state doesn't matter. The state matters, right? But let's not privilege the state. Let's actually set the state and not social institutions on the same and on the same sort of theoretical framework, but multiple sets of institutions and arenas of authority, right? So it's understanding that it's a plurality. Another thing, now this one you will find in a footnote because I was told to tone it down, but I actually don't even understand why we necessarily need to think of the state as being any different than any other arena of authority in any other set of institutions, right? So I used to sort of make this long kind of claim as to why it was ridiculous to even privilege it by saying the state and setting the state and other social institutions and arenas on the same footing, and that seemed to be disruptive into political science. Yeah, it was not okay. So now there's a footnote that says something like some may argue, which actually means like I would argue, but I'm just in the some. Okay, so if we want to think about this, right? So far, what I've tried to put on the table is that we can think of how individuals behave and ultimately how these are going to aggregate to different outcomes in terms of their own understanding of themselves with regards to the expectations in different arenas of authority, by which I mean different sets of communities that have kind of boundaries, et cetera. We'll come to that. And with regards to the expectations within each of them, right? So the first thing we need to do then really is to understand what do we mean by an arena of authority? What are these communities and what are the ways in which we should understand them? So nothing particularly earth-shattering here. I'm working my way back to rereading, but like hopefully with an understanding this time Bordeaux, because I'm understanding like there may be somewhat sort of overlaps. But basically, I think of arenas of authority almost like you think of a football stadium, right? So it really does have boundaries. People are in the community or they're out of the community. Within it, they can basically have different, it can be easier or harder to get in, right? I mean, there can be boundaries that are actually porous. You can't leave, you can't get in, even if you wanted to, right? There can be others that are actually quite porous and quite fluid. We think about sort of the membership of individuals within it, whether or not it's voluntary in a sense doesn't matter, right? And then we can think about them as having shared goals. And what I mean by shared goals, I think is important to interrogate, because we can say, okay, well, wait a second, we know that in almost every community we know, right? Whether we're talking about states and polities, right? We just saw this with the elections. People can have very different sets of goals. They can be vying for power and resources. They can be vying for a different idea of like what are we and what's our way of life. But the single shared goal that unites everyone, whether it's in a religious community, a sort of a polity, et cetera, is the idea that you want to perpetuate the community, right? So the one thing that unites you is sort of an interest in maintaining the community, even if you can fight over who should have power within it or what actually we should look like, right? So the second thing then is to say, okay, when this community within this arena, what do they actually do and how do we understand the social institutions? And here, there's a range of understandings of social institutions. Sometimes, again, in the literature, you see it almost as synonymous with organization. Definitely want to move away from that. You get some things like north, which are much more almost, fundamentally rule-based. This is actually a more Ostromian notion of it. In fact, if you look at her definition and this one is very, very similar in some ways. Basically, we can think about people as having different roles, right? And those that can actually be determined in many ways by the rules, like, what can women do, right? So sort of mapping gender onto what are the roles that people can take. Rules that determine basically what you are obligated to do, what you should be doing, and then what, and finally kind of the rewards or what's associated with their outcomes. Nothing like, no rocket science here, right? It's a very sort of straightforward notion. But the one thing I do want to, sort of flag is that we are getting away from a conflation of informal institutions and social institutions, right? So you can have, formal and informal, we're thinking in terms of kind of parchment institutions where it's established in that sense. Social institutions can actually be both formal and informal. And I think that's an important distinction. So then the first question is, which arenas matter and why, right? I mean, because, otherwise think about it, the world we described is, there's 1,000 things that can matter, and how do we start to make sense of this, and how can we start to actually have a framework which may not be 100% right? I mean, I think the idea is to set a basis for a conversation that we can then interrogate the different elements of, but how do we understand what matters? So the first thing I want to argue is that we get different saliences for different, arenas of authority. That, some things are very important to, a community, right? They may, think about religious communities. It may be very important to them how they think about, marriage, and sort of baptism, death. It's sort of that. It may also be that we're talking about, and I think we have ways in which we think about classes and markets as also arenas of authority, and that might not be important to them at all. So there's some things that are salient and some things that aren't. And what we talk about is domain congruence, and that's the extent to which whatever activity you're talking about and this arena of authority essentially kind of map onto each other. This is not the only way to think about it, but one way that I've thought about it with Kate Baldwin and Kristen Gao and myself and a piece that we have is to think about it in terms of basically the levels of authority, whether something is from sort of local or super local, and thinking about whether or not it is under state or customary authority. Okay. So what we do here is we argue that essentially we would think that the question of like whether or not you should listen to an MP, or whether you should listen to somebody who's telling you who you should vote for in a presidential election, that the MP it's much more of a state and a super local, kind of activity, and MPs would have more sort of authority over that than customary chiefs or head persons or local counselors. If you're thinking about contributing to a school fund, right, then it might be it's a much more, schools are state institutions. They're very local, so your local counselor should have more influence over you with regards to that. Burial funds are basically sort of very local and customary, so we would have expected that the head person would have more influence over that. So we a priori sort of make these distinctions, and then what we do is we're interested in thinking about, how can we explore who is able to get people to comply, right? Where do we really see these authorities as showing up? And so we ran a survey experiment because that's what we have done a lot of. And basically what we did is we asked people, we read them a statement that said essentially, your MP or your local counselor or your elder is asking you or your customary chief actually is asking you to contribute to a school fund, or they're asking you to contribute to a burial fund, or they're asking you to vote for this presidential candidate. How likely would you be to do so? So it's self-reported willingness in a survey experiment. We still see quite a lot of variation, and importantly, what we see is that we code these as being some congruence if, for example, if it's a state, but the local counselor, for example, for voting has some congruence because they're both state activities, but it's not the right level. High congruence is when it maps exactly. So voting in MPs, local counselors in schools, village heads. And what we find is that basically there's comparative advantages of all of these different authorities, but the level of congruence actually matters. right? So you're much more likely to get compliance when the activity and the level of the activity and the level of the leader map onto each other, the level and the nature in terms of customary versus state. So that's just one way of thinking about how we can understand congruence and domain congruence. But kind of the broader argument is that domain congruence should make a difference for how we see these things. We can also say, okay, there's also differences in the strength arena. So it's all well and good for authorities and other members of the community to care about what you do. But then how much they can actually influence you still can vary based on the strength of the arena. And there's a lot of ways we can think about this. One is just thinking about the level of solidarity among the members, right? So to what extent are they going to know each other, communicate, sort of, even come together to, either reward you for complying or not, and how much do you actually ultimately just want to contribute to the community, right? A second way to think about it is in terms of how encompassing that community is. So there's some that, in some areas of authority that basically touch on almost all aspects of individuals' lives, right? Whether or not you are able to sort of marry or get your daughter married, whether or not you're able to find a job, whether or not you're able to sort of maintain and hold on to your land, all of those things are still are kind of linked to good standing within the same community. We have other cases where yes, it matters in terms of whether or not I'm going to kind of keep this job, or it matters whether or not I'm going to have a kind of a nice sort of social life, but everything else is independent. And then finally, there's differences in terms of networks and information flow, right? So where people are much more likely, can be the same number of people in the community, but sometimes people talk, they know each other, they sort of engage, in other cases that they don't. So what we have here, just as kind of evidence of these kinds of mechanisms, this is that same experiment I just described, where we've got the different authorities who are asking people to do different activities. Now we're looking at, this is with Priska Yost, and we're looking at, first of all, how proximate are these leaders, right? Are they near you, or are they actually more distant? Because that the local and super local, but also how dense are the social ties in your community. So we're looking at a multi-level model, and basically what we find is proximity matters, but so does the extent to that's the first one, right? And then so does the extent to which the neighborhood social ties are dense. And actually what's really happening here, if you take the density of social ties independently into account as well, what's really actually happening is the fact that the more distant leaders have a much harder time gaining compliance in a dense community than the local leaders. So it's not really so much that the local leaders' power is different, it's the more distant leaders' power is that much less. So that's one way to think of it in terms of what's going on with the arenas themselves. The other way to think about it is that we also still have a lot of individual variation. And we all know this, right? We can look at any community we're in and any arena that we're actually engaged in ourselves. And we know some people seem to need to follow the rules a whole lot more than others do, right? And then we can sometimes it's just idiosyncratic. You just get some people who don't seem to follow the rules no matter what, and that's just the way it is. But a lot of times there's actually systematic individual characteristics that help to explain this. So we can think a lot about the extent to which some people are more educated, more mobile, essentially more able to escape a community than others are, right? Have more different sets of authorities, and we'll go back to sort of the levels of encompassing, but there's individual characteristics that make those differences. And so this is coming from some work I did a long time ago, but basically on Jordanian elections. And what you see in those elections is that individuals who are in the tribe has an impact on how people vote, but individuals who are in tribal networks in rural areas are much more likely to vote for tribal candidates than those who are in the urban areas. And actually, frankly, also just much more likely to vote, right? So in urban areas, it's not that they had a great alternative. They just didn't have anybody they didn't need to vote, basically. But in rural areas, the get out the vote actually is much stronger, and the sort of the willingness to vote for your tribal member is much higher, because those are the people who still have a lot to say about how your disputes are resolved and whether or not you're seen as being a good member, and all of the things that we talked about before. So that's how we can think about which arenas matter. And then the next question I think is how do we understand what types of institutions and how to think about social institutions? And social institutions are more difficult in some ways because here it becomes very specific, right? So we can say, okay, let's think about religion and public health, for instance, right? So, whether or not I'm going to take the COVID vaccine. Now, some religions, could actually, and we see this actually, there was a study done in Utah, I think it was, that really found that the bishops had a lot to do with whether or not individuals would take the vaccine. Because, in some cases, they're not necessarily, there's no religious, kind of reason not to, and, kind of the endorsement can mean a lot, right? But in other cases, the endorsement is never going to come for taking a public, taking a vaccination because the entire idea of engaging in healthcare is off the table, right? So to some extent, what behaviors individuals will have as members of the community is driven by very specific, institutional rules. And I would argue that if you were looking at, whatever sort of outcomes you want to influence, especially in the sort of, kind of the development of practitioners, they really need to sort of actually sit down and understand what are those sets of rules as opposed to just, kind of hand wave and make assumptions about them. But I also think that we can think about specific sets of rules as a way of turning our attention to where we would look, right? So it's, now it's not just, okay, let's look at, the rules regarding, this individual practice of, getting healthcare or not, that there are other sets of rules that can help us to understand when institutions will be strong, when we'll get different sets of outcomes, et cetera. And so I looked at 3 of these. The first is leadership selection, right? And here there's an interesting mapping in terms of what the existing literature shows and what we think of in terms of something like democracy, right? So the argument about democracy is often around responsiveness and accountability, that when we get more competition for leaders, then people actually have to be more responsive to followers, if you will. And we actually see quite a lot of evidence for this in the existing literature. So Acemoglu, Reed, and Robinson, for instance, are looking at it in Sierra Leone and finding that more competitive sort of areas in terms of the numbers of clans competing for the chieftaincy actually get better outcomes. We find this with Ella Gao when she looks at sort of minorities and minority tribes and the numbers of tribes that exist in municipalities in Jordan. She finds similar evidence. The second thing that I think the kind of broad set of rules that we can look at are regarding individualist and collectivist rules, right? And ultimately, all rules are about, in the way I portrayed it at the beginning, individuals sort of bear the costs or gain the rewards of following or not following rules. But there are differences in terms of how communities establish themselves and the nature of rules that either suggest that every individual should be basically kind of maximizing their own welfare, or that what is actually really sort of expected and rewarded is that you maximize the community welfare, right? And those, I think, are very different rules. And it's one of the things that's always sort of bothered me about a lot of the literature on clientelism and vote buying is that it often sort of reduced to, kind of these very individual quid pro quo relationships between voters and candidates or candidates brokers. And yet at the same time, they often find that, whether or not the broker is really from the community makes a lot of difference, that there's a whole set of other factors that come into play, and that they come into play, of course, differently across different contexts. The other part I want to draw your attention to is this Mazzucati and Kupke piece, not my own piece actually at the moment, but that because they're trying to understand why it is that people in the Netherlands are sending money back for burial funds in Africa, essentially. And you can say, okay, so sending money is a fairly significant amount. A lot of it goes for the taxes of, is essentially given in tax to the community. But more importantly, if somebody hasn't paid, they can't, they and their family members can't be buried in that community, right? So for the person living in Amsterdam, that's not a big deal for themselves. What it matters for is the fact that this has costs on their family members, right? Their family members can't hold their heads high. They can't sort of be buried, that those costs get borne collectively. And so I think it's really important for us to pay a lot of attention and probably more attention than has been paid to individuals versus collectivist rules that exist. The third type of rule, again, that's all I want to turn our attention to at the moment, are group boundaries and group maintenance rules. Okay, and group boundary rules are rules that determine whether or not you can be in and out of the group, but group maintenance rules are those that try to sort of make sure that the group portrays itself as strong, unified, cohesive, that we are who we are. Right? I mean, you see these in everything from, you know, rules about how individuals should dress to how they should engage. Right? And here I had an interesting experience in early 2010s in Libya. So it was 2012, and I was doing party strengthening with NDI in Libya, and was talking to somebody who had been elected as an MP, as a member of the GNC. And he was telling me about how he had, you know, he and a couple of other minor tribes had gotten together, you know, put together a list that then beat the major tribe in the area. And so he said, you know, we had 5,000, they had 3,000, the other tribe had 2,000, you know, we knew that the major tribe had 8,000, and so that we would beat them. And I said, okay, that's nice, but, you know, how did you know that they would all vote for you, right? And he said, you know, we know not everybody will vote for us, but we know, we'll also know that not everybody will vote, you know, will vote for them, right? So assuming that that's relatively equal, we're still okay, right? By the way, they also do a lot in Jordan, especially, you know, they sit outside and they have tribal rules, and they will go hunting down people and bringing them to mobilize. So it's not as sort of benign as this is going to sound. But then I said, okay, so say somebody doesn't vote for you, then, you know, then sort of what then? What if you know somebody didn't vote for you? So, well, you know, it's okay. They cannot vote for us. But what they can't do, he continues to say, is that they can't stand up and publicly say they're not going to vote. Right. So that's a great example of, you know, it's okay not to comply. It's okay not to support me. It is not okay to stand up and publicly say you're not going to support me, because what that does is essentially undermine the notion that we're a cohesive, you know, strong group, and get, you know, that there's sort of that we are unified, right? So those sets of rules matter, because now we have elections where, you know, people actually can't voice their opinion, right? That's part of what happens. The other part I think is important is not just that we can understand how these types of institutions or rules affect the behavior, but that we should also understand that they affect what we think of as sort of state institutions. So they affect the ways in which state institutions get formed. And I would even go so far as to argue that we shouldn't really be thinking of institutions or actors as being state or non-state or religious, or like the ways in which we often think of them as being individual, but that what we think of as state institutions are at one and the same time also institutions that are shaping these, you know, kind of distributions of power and the ways in which things work within tribes, localities, or these other sets of communities. So I see this very clearly with the Libyan electoral rules in 2012. Guys, back to Libya. But what was interesting there was that the period under Gaddafi had been a period where parties were outlawed. There was a sort of a common saying that essentially meant that if you were a party member, you were a traitor. You could basically get in capital punishment if you were a party member, but also if you knew somebody was a party member and you had not informed on them. So people were, not surprisingly, when you start talking about parties in 2012, they're like, whoa, no, right? But the international community, of course, likes parties and thinks that's the way that we do elections. And so they wanted to see party strengthening. There was a set of people from the diaspora who wanted to see party strengthening, and then most effectively the sort of Libyan equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood that wanted to see parties. So there is a constituency that's interested in seeing PR systems and party strengthening. But then there's also a lot of people who recognize that you need to have sort of authoritarian rules and independent seats. So, not surprisingly, they said, what's, you know, so they called in people from some people who some of us know, and you know, to all come in and tell them what's the ideal electoral system. People know nothing about Libya, but they knew a lot about elections and how they should work, and essentially kind of in a vacuum. And so they came in and said, it could be like a German two-tier system. So if you know that system, it's got a set of PR, you know, constituencies, it's got a set of independent constituencies underneath them, and they map nice and neat. It's very relatively messy. So they decided this is what we're going to put into place in Libya, right? And you get this whole idea of 120 seats, and you know, going to have sort of 80 party seats, and this is how it will work. Now, they sort of announced that this is going to be the election law and what's going to be the districts. And the phones start ringing, the people, the delegations start visiting. And they're like, we can't do this. So what you're getting is people, especially from the mountainous regions particularly, and the kind of more rural regions, where there's a lot of community animosity, the communities laying next to each other. There's a lot of Amazigh and Arab communities that are laying next to each other. So part of it is about ethnicity and identity, but part of it is just about the fact that this community wronged that community, 200 years ago, and nobody's forgotten about it. So there was a sense in which that was not going to fly. And there was another part I failed to mention so far, but that was complicating it even more, and that was that the Libyan elections are being put into place after the Tunisian elections, and also in this notion of what will make sort of good representation and women's empowerment, etc. They decided not only to have a zipper quota system, which meant that on the party list, every other seat had to be a woman or a man, but then to sort of one up from the Tunisian, and recognizing that the Tunisian system had still returned a sort of a disproportionate number of men compared to the population. They decided it was going to be also a horizontal zipper system, which means that every seat on a list has to be alternating man or woman. And then if your party runs more than one list, then every list has to start either with a man or a woman. So you basically have to try to see parity across those, right? Because in list systems, then if you've won 2 seats, the top 2 seats get a seat, right? We'll get a position. So the top 2 people on the list get a position. So we have the second problem that a lot of people faced was the fact that these were places where women weren't supposed to be in the public sphere. They weren't supposed to be going out by themselves, yet alone were they supposed to be going, to do campaigning, or God forbid, actually get elected and be going to Tripoli. So none of this was going to work for them. So they also sort of made these strong cases. This is not acceptable. But why is it not acceptable? It's not acceptable not because nobody likes the idea of like having, a sort of a 2-tiered system and looking like Germany. It's not acceptable because the system has run headlong into all of these other sets of institutions and expectations that are about arenas that have nothing to do with politics per se. So here's the result. The result is that in places like Benghazi or Tripoli, as you can see, so just to be clear, the blue lines, dark blue, are majoritarian sort of independent seats. The lighter blue lines are your PR seats, right? The lists. And so Benghazi and Tripoli end up with, getting the bulk of these sort of seats pushed to them. A place like Harayan refused altogether to have anything except for independent seats and becomes independent. Leads to an absolute disaster in terms of electoral administration. You have to print all these very, very different ballots for everywhere that you're going. It led to, sort of a lot of the electoral, I've talked to them at the time, a lot of the experts on elections, in electoral engineering were incredibly up in arms. What is wrong with these people? They don't understand. But really, you could also argue that who hadn't understood was fundamentally the people who had decided that you were going to have, sort of a vision of how you would institute and implement these laws that was entirely independent of all of the other sort of hats people wear, arenas they're in, and institutional rules that are supposed to guide their behavior. So that gives you a sense of what I think are some of the implications for how we should sort of think about studying politics and development. But I want to also flag a few other things I think might be of interest and might be useful to think through. So one is that, fundamentally, I'm asking almost to turn upside down a lot of the ways in which I think we often study this. So I think a lot of times we study, we take institutions as our starting point, then we move down, or we decide we're doing religion and politics, and that's our starting point, and then we move down to how that impacts, how people will engage, etc. I'm asking us to almost flip that and to actually really say, okay, I'm interested in understanding voting. I mean, it's could be all the sort of usual political things that people think about, right? I'm interested in voting, service provision, dispute resolution, etc. But let me start by thinking, first of all, when a person goes to the ballot box, or when they go to, a court, or when they go, what do they actually see themselves in for engaging in, right? So, another example is, people have been surprised that when you allow alternative, when you foster and make it easier for women to access state courts versus the traditional courts, right? That a lot of the sort of most marginalized women still continue to access the judicial courts, right? And they're like, wait a second, their outcomes are so much worse. Well, their outcomes might be so much worse on the exact day that they're in court, right? But for everything else that's going to follow, right? The outcome for deciding that you're going to go to the state versus to your sort of customary, sort of dispute resolution mechanism is so much worse. Right? So thinking about it from the position of the woman or position of the person, I mean, what she's doing is she's thinking about how does she maintain relations with her family and with her community at the same time as she's thinking about how does she solve this particular problem. So then we can actually say, okay, how do the individuals see this? How do the authorities see this? Who's actually engaged? For whom is this an important issue? How much do those different arenas matter to the individual? Then what are they going to do? And then how does that aggregate to the outcomes that we see? So first, I'm asking us to rethink the kind of the process. I've already nodded to this, but I also think that there's ways in which it really asks us to really like rethink and interrogate much more the role of formality, right? Rather than simply assuming that informal, that social institutions are informal and that formality is not even a question. So this was work with Karen Free and Lauren Honig and Melanie Phillips, where what we were looking at was, how much do people want to have a written document that sort of demonstrates that they have land, right? And what we found was that they actually did prefer to have a written document, but it didn't matter if that written document was from the state or the customary authority, which I think would surprise many people who think that somehow states have more teeth and a greater enforcement ability. And more importantly, it mattered to them because the formality of it basically appears to be signaling to others in the community that they have a right to it. Not so much because they think that the state or the customary authority will actually come down and sort of be on their behalf, but because of the legibility that it offers. And so it's asking us to think both about, interrogate what's the role of formality, but also then think about why does it actually matter. Also, I think there's ways in which we can start to think about how authorities compete against themselves, right? So we see, for example, that you get states right now in places like Zambia and Malawi really trying to push for having joint land management, right, and land ownership as well. And so we can think about both the state then and sort of lineage systems and ethnic groups is essentially kind of competing against each other in terms of how much they can kind of control and who has authority over individuals. The same thing with the dispute resolution I was talking about before between states and customary authorities. And what we're finding so far is that that the extent to which the state is proximate, same idea as we had before, seems to make a difference for how much there's land management change, but also the extent to whether it was patrilineal or matrilineal. And that patrilineal cases, basically men have a lot more to lose because in matrilineal cases, there was already a modicum of joint land management, right? So thinking about how those sets of institutions affect sort of the ability of competing authorities to make claims. The other thing that we're thinking about is boundary rules, right? So I talked about this before with regards to kind of the elections, but another way to think through it in this case is thinking about migration. So a lot of times when we're talking about international migration, we're very clear that, some states are harder to get into than others, that, there's places where you can go if you're a Syrian and you went to Jordan, then at least you spoke the language and you had the same religion. And sometimes you had tribal ties, et cetera. Whereas if you went to Sweden, it was a new religion and a whole new world, essentially, right? So how much does that make a difference for how people engage and interact? Here we're trying to say that this is with Hans Luters and Erica Metheny, and we're arguing that we also see those same variations across communities, subnationally, right? And so if we're thinking about domestic migration, it's not as simple as everybody can go everywhere, and it's not as simple as once I get there, I can easily integrate. And in fact, what we see, even in the States, you've got some communities where you can't go into, or you can't go into either officially or else, essentially kind of, that once you get there, you may be almost pushed out as quickly as you arrived, right? But in Malawi and Zambia, we've kind of this nice in a sense thing that we have also very, kind of clear differences between communities where customary authorities are the ones who can determine whether or not you can get land or that it's open. And what we have is what we call ethnicized social institutions, where your ethnicity either creates a barrier for you to engage or not. And in this project, we look at a lot of different outcomes, but that's sort of trying to make the understanding of how these factors affect political engagement in the ways that people think about it. And find, for instance, with regards to registering to vote, permission, people would had to get permission to land, actually more likely to register to vote in that village than elsewhere, right? But at the same time, where there's sort of higher levels of kind of non-cooperation because of ethnicity, they're less likely to register. Right? So that's, just again, an example of the kinds of questions we can ask and the kinds of answers we can get. It's not very nice, but so Professor, which has really had mentioned this earlier, we were doing a lot of work and think it's really important to figure out how to measure these things, right? And to understand the extent to which, a lot of this variation is very local, right? So this is an example from the local governance processes indices, which used to be called performance indices, except for we decided that really what they're measuring is processes, so we should call them that. And it's to understand in this case, how much was your participation in the sort of state elections and state meetings, I'm sorry, party events, based on, sort of positive sort of incentives or negative incentives. And we see that while within a single area, there's actually not that much difference. Even within sort of regions, there's not like that much difference, but within localities, there's a lot. I mean, again, it shouldn't be surprising given all the other things that we've talked about, but part of the effort is then to really come up with really kind of good ways to measure these. So finally, I've just some thinking about what it means for programs and policies. I've nodded to some of these, so we'll think about them fairly briefly. One is that, sort of there's a effort, which I agree with, to take context seriously and to therefore kind of move away from isomorphism and expectations that what works here works everywhere else, and it means the same thing. But I'm just trying to give us a way that we can actually do that, right? That's sort of systematic, and that we can do it and have conversations across very different studies and findings and places and make sense of them. Similarly, there's this question that Kelsey had or argument that was about going with the grain, right? But then it was a little bit vague about what going with the grain meant, right? And I would argue going with the grain means recognizing what arenas of authority there are, what social institutions are expecting of people, and the extent to which you can or don't, or don't sort of implement policies that map onto those or run head on to them. And then finally, again, there's sort of a question, can we aggregate knowledge? So, even more recently, there's been this idea of having this kind of problem-driven iterative adaptation models, which are nice. The idea being that you put into place the policy, you sort of watch it, you change, you adapt, etc. My concern with that, absent the kinds of attention to what exactly is the context and how can we understand it more precisely, is that we're not really able over time to determine what can work in one place and can't work in another. The aggregation of knowledge, I think, really gets sort of undermined, and I'm hoping that this is a way to get at it. So basically, there's a lot of new questions I think that this raises. Questions about how do we understand when authorities sort of compete with each other, or communities compete with each other over individuals' decisions, and when do they sort of gain strength? We haven't talked about it much, but there's an idea of bridge actors. So these people who have actually kind of authority are important in multiple arenas. And then how do they, to what extent do they then shape things, and how can they be used if you're from a programmatic perspective as kind of levers? I think people intuitively know that, right? When we talk about, who are key actors, but this is a way of thinking about it and also starting to really interrogate the nature of that. How do the sort of behaviors aggregate to outcome? I've been very hand wavy about this so far. And I think this is actually from our perspective, one of the very much sort of next real issues is trying to think through those questions. And then basically, how can we think about these sets of dynamics over time, right? These are things are kind of constantly adapting situations. So just, I'm going to give you very quickly sort of the notion of my own work. Just remember, I want claiming. So tell me if any of these sort of overlap with things that you're doing. Again, one thing is to work on these local governance process indicators, which are I worked on this since 2013, which probably before some of you were out of grade school, but That's, it's a way of trying to understand how we can use, kind of more concisely use, in our case, surveys. To really understand who matters, what is expected, and how do they shape what people do. There's the sort of the migration work I mentioned earlier on sort of boundaries and barriers. We're doing some work on gender as well as on kith and kin and the extent to which those shape outcomes, particularly within the Middle East, as well as a collaborative project that's competing authorities in the Middle East, trying to understand how they compete over various types of outcomes. I'm pretty agnostic as to what those outcomes are. And there actually will be a call for participation in that coming out in the next month or so. We're doing work on understanding the drivers of resilience in communities in Malawi, on governance and urbanization, and then finally, and most new, trying to start thinking through local governance as a complex system, which is new to me. So that's it. Thank you for coming and talk to me.
So that's a lot to think about. And it's just such a beautiful synthesis of so much of the work that you've done. But one of the questions I had was, the model that the approach that you've laid out is also seems agnostic about institutional type. Like, is it a centralized system versus a decentralized system? There was some mention of matrilineal versus patrilineal systems. So the state on the one hand, of course, the model, the approach, I wouldn't call it more than model, it's an approach, allows you to account for the different kinds of governance institutions, state institutions, but also the different types of customary institutions, because there's huge variation, right? Whether centralized, egalitarian, hierarchical, and I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, about how this approach, like, do you have any predictions for different types of political institutions? There's no mention here of like more decentralization, but would imagine that a more decentralized system would allow for greater interaction, greater allowing, for example, formal institutions to take account of those preferences at the local level and to be better, to interface better, to create better boundary institutions in some ways. Just wondering if you could say more.
So that's a great question. And actually, we have an edited volume on decentralization that's in review right now, because I think it is an interesting question about what's the politics under decentralization. In this case, we're looking at it within the Middle East and North Africa again. And I would argue that we can't make a prediction about what's the role of decentralization absent understanding these other sets of institutions, right? And there's questions about at what level we're interested in, right? I mean, much of our work is actually at the most local geographic level, right? We can think of, even if we're talking about, aggregating up, what does it mean for national, economic growth or something like that? That in aggregating up, we would still actually be thinking about it at the local level, and then how does that actually aggregate, right? Which is, again, get back to part of the question. But we know from both from past literature and also the studies we've just done that, decentralization doesn't always do what we expected it to do, right? It doesn't always give us, sort of more responsiveness and more sort of access to the state and all of the things that were anticipated as the result, haven't always been what we've achieved, right? And I would argue that the way to understand that is to say, okay, decentralization, which context? And we also know that decentralization in a single country may have very different implications at the subnational level, because it runs into very strong other communities and arenas of authority in one case and much less in another case, right? So that's not answering you with here's my hypothesis, but my expectation is where you look to see does decentralization even matter? Starts with a question of what's the relationship between the relative strength and importance of state and state institutions versus all of these other institutions, because frankly, where it's weak, you can decentralize all you want. I mean, it's one of the ironies, this is a slightly different issue, but it's one of the ironies of being so excited about things like democratization in a place like Malawi, or where basically it's really customary institutions that matter, right? So if, the way I'm gonna resolve disputes, get land distributed to me, decide, basically almost everything about my life has nothing to do with who's elected MP, then the only way you get it to, in a sense, kind of to matter is the extent to which resources get funneled down to you potentially differently, now because there can be a link between, your chief or whatever and the MP, right? That's work with kind of Kate Baldwin has done some of that work. We see that, I'm sorry for rambling, but I love this stuff. We see that tribes became actually, there's an argument that tribes actually became more important in places like Jordan, but also in places like Malawi after competitive elections in Jordan and democratization in Malawi, because suddenly, not because that those institutions undermined these, right, but rather because they were able to tap into the resources that sort of, links with the state made, and they still had sort of the ability to make those claims on a kind of sort of, in this case, tribal basis. Was that as non-answer as you can get?
No, this is really great. Because these institutions have such different effects. Decentralization happens for so many different reasons.
And when different, I mean, even if it happens for different reasons, right? And the reasons often are signals of what these other differences were, right? I'm not sure I would think it's the reason for that mattered as much as the fact that, to what extent is that mapping onto the fact that you already had, much stronger other sets of institutions and how they link to the state, right? And that linking to the state is this rejectors out there.
Oh, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the research that you would be doing on either governance and urbanization or the work on local governance in different places. Both are intriguing topics. So I'm just wondering where you might go.
Yeah, so the governance and urbanization project is one that it's with Jeff Powder, Allison Post, and Intisar Fariji, and blanking on his name, is a Ghanaian. So that particular project is basically looking at urbanization in secondary cities in Ghana, Tunisia, and in Brazil, and trying to understand how it's affecting and affected by the effects of kind of various communities and institutions within those countries and those localities. The idea being that there's much more subnational variation or community variation in the urban areas than we often take into account and consider. We're also implementing the LGPI in those cases as a way of understanding better, these who matters and who has influence, things like, for example, market leaders, in the marketplace leaders, right, have a lot of influence that goes way beyond the marketplace in many of these institutions, and as does the sort of this, Jeff Ballard made this argument about different types of communities, that you get some that were kind of indigenous and had kind of long-standing ties in the matter of these, a notion of this is our community for a certain group of people and everybody else is the newcomer, and others that were more settler communities. And so we're choosing cases that allow us to actually interrogate that further. The local governance complexity, we're at the very beginning of this. I mean, we're at the point where what we've decided is the only way to really understand the, sort of the aggregation of the things I've been talking about, right, is really to think about it as a complex system. Start modeling it as such. We're hoping that the kind of data that we've collected and that we will collect is allowing us to actually start that in ways that were more difficult before, and that some of these understandings of kind of the individual linkages, I think of it a lot of as agent-based modeling, because that's the sort of the thing that I'm most comfortable with, right? But really starting to build those models and seeing how they map onto empirics, but also then saying, okay, what happens when we think about decentralization? What happens when we think about, if you can change the sort of the preferences or the sort of expectations of a certain group. And finally, just because we were working on this with a climate change expert, what also happens, and climate change has made a lot more inroads into complexity than local governance has. You know, how do we think about the implications of climate change on communities, right? So if you think about how they may differentially affect different numbers of groups. But that's in my like most surface level understanding so far. Ask me in hopefully like 2 or 3 years, I will give you a better answer.
Just a quick follow-up in terms of a lot of what you're describing, including thinking about like governance and urbanization and just the role of social institutions. I mean, it reminds me of like thinking in terms of like the social capital literature as being significant, as well as a lot of, I think, where you're coming to like, all right, there's an interrelationship between these things, people have different roles. That reminds me of like the Ostromian, like as it became like the IAD approach and like the social ecological system stuff in our class. You know, we read some of that stuff and we read a lot of it in our class on natural resource governance. But I guess I'm just the idea that social institutions matter for behavior. I mean, I think is maybe political scientists hadn't focused on it, but I think if you start off and say Eleanor Ostrom is political science and like talked about the relationship, you know, all this stuff, it seems almost like this is like, you know, Stromian approach and with some insight from social capital, the social capital literature, and you can even throw in there like a dose of like the economics literature that says you need to look at the fit between formal and informal institutions for things to get to work better. As like property rights literature is like the main way you can kind of get good institutions is when you match its congruence between the formal rules and the informal rules. So I guess I'm just wondering in terms of like that other literature, like what is the kind of is this building on that or is this different from that?
No, so all of those I actually discussed in it, and there's, the point is not that this is totally different. The point is that this is trying to sort of take from these different things that I think were kind of almost, doesn't sound like, but like almost incomplete findings and expectations, and trying to think about, you know, can we find a framework that we can put them together in? And then we can, you know, start to say, okay, I know that this is a case of X, right? And that we can have a lot more aggregation of knowledge across what are currently very disparate sets of work. So with Ostrom, I mean, what I think is slightly different is that, you know, Ostrom in many ways is thinking about it as, yes, these sets of social institutions matter, and, you know, and sort of the kind of polyarchy and the different levels matter. But polycentricity, not polyarchy, but there's a way in which it's not necessarily about competition between arenas, right? It's almost as if it's a single arena and with multiple actors and players in it. And I'm trying to say we can actually get, I think, farther by thinking about them as multiple arenas of which individuals are actually making choices within them, right? So a layering of competing arenas as opposed to an arena that is more complex in that sense, right? With social capital, I think that the issue, at least a lot of that, has taken this as almost a necessary good, right? So we're take Putnam, right, which was kind of the founding, and not the founding father of social capital, but certainly got the most attention by it. You know, the idea is that, you know, these links and that all of these things are necessarily going to sort of they lead to cooperation, they lead to better outcomes, et cetera. And what I'm trying to say is that there's a very clear distinction between, you know, links and engagement and what you actually get as outcomes of them. And let's think much more carefully about the nature of those institutional expectations and rules and inequalities as well within them, right? So those are some of the, I forget the third literature you just mentioned.
Just the property rights.
Yeah. So and that of course, you know, my big beef with that one is the fact that we've got, you know, is an assumption of informality, right? And often a lot not that people in individual work don't think about what does this actually, you know, what are you trying to make congruent, right? In the application of it. But in terms of sort of then creating the basis for a typology of really thinking through those, I think it's lacking, right? So it does a sort of thing of, you know, state, you know, fairly well defined, property rights fairly well defined, you know, other not. But you can tell me if I'm wrong. It looks like you can touch on. And
No,
that's fine.
I was just thinking, I mean, I like the direction you're going, but I was just, it led me to also think too about just the question of everyday choices and like the tradition, like the subjectivist traditions in economics, which you probably haven't gotten into,
No.
but I had just been thinking, like, there's such a rich tradition that looks at like individual choices as basically being something that's going to be shaped and constrained by like all manner of things. And it's hard to predict, and you're coming around to complexity. So, I mean, it's something I look forward, to where you go with this, but I'm happy to offer more suggestions.
I was gonna say, actually offer suggestions of readings. too. I'm
It
happy
was,
to.
yeah, like North's mental models.
Yeah.
Like, that kind of tries to provide a general framework where you have formal and informal institutions interacting, but you also have a lot of persistence within how individuals think about things. That is gonna explain behavior, so, I mean, I think that there's, you do, I mean, I think you have a general framework in the sense that like, it's competing with the IAD framework, so all this other stuff, kind of fits into, so.
I'm-
So lots to think about.
I'm actually, it's funny, the everyday choices seems to be getting me in trouble because I think of everyday choices as basically saying that when we're thinking of things like, people making what they think of as, political choices, right? That these are actually choices, like everyday choices in the sense of their choices that have to do with many other aspects of their everyday lives, right? So it's, and I've had a lot of questions about like, is this really choice? And where like, but that's actually not where I was going with it. I was actually going with it on like the everyday part of it, not on the choices part of it. Yeah.
The big puzzle.
Yeah.
I just want to echo your point about being different from Austria, because I think she has this design principle for me that drives me crazy. And the line, it's like scripture. So at the end, it says, the state shall recognize all of these nice things. that the
And it
community
would be
does."
better if they do.
Yes, and to me, that's like ruin the whole thing by that.
Yeah.
Right, and then it bounds it, and puts in a nice bow and ties it up, and then you have this nice place where all of this stuff happened that's like protected, but reality that's,
And it's such an odd thing for the fact that what she was really trying to do was push us to understanding kind of the other ways in which communities can matter, et cetera. But then coming back to the state like centricity of it in a sense, right? Which you also see in like people like Jim Scott and like all of these who like start out saying there's all these other things, but really like, the holy grail is still the state. It's a very strange, it's a strange conclusion.
when you, like, people are making choices and the state, it's, and political science is so wrapped up in the state. And to me, it's just so strange because like how we understand the state here, they're predatory states all over the world. So the fact that people would run away from it is so shocking to so many people. Like to still.
But people run away from it here.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the irony, right? I mean, it's not exactly like they
No,
don't. So, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I appreciate your point about like, I think this critique of PA is being somewhat atheoretical and like, then making like aggregation of knowledge hard is like a super hard statement, but we also been thinking about how do we aggregate knowledge about very complex contexts and our interventions. And I've always felt like interventions are taken as like homogeneous units that can be placed over places. And so as you were talking, I was thinking that, so when someone goes to vote, they construct voting in a certain way that's, drawing on whatever all these social forces in their arena or arenas. But then also, when someone who's setting up the election is setting it up there, they tend to make these micro decisions about how we should do this here. So even the person who's setting it up is often acknowledging they're not doing the same thing in each place. There's all these small variations. Anyway, the point where I think it's maybe my question would be, as you're thinking about both the person who's creating the intervention, whatever it is, and using complexity kind of intuitively to adjust, and then also the person who's going to vote and using the complexity of their situation to make choices, how would you, I mean, I'm just curious what your first run of trying to get up this accumulation ladder would be, because like, I think it's very convincing, but then I'm actually interested in your thoughts.
No, so I mean, basically you're absolutely right. And I think that a lot of action practitioners, when they're doing things, do take these things into account and recognize it, right? But the problem is, okay, so I've taken it into account, and there's two parts. One is I've taken it into account in context A, where it turns out that, gender was very salient in terms of determining what rules that people could have. And therefore, meant that these, quota rules would not, it's not just, there's a balance between I want a rule that might disrupt the status quo, because that might actually be what I'm intending to do, which is perfectly fine, right? But if you disrupt the status quo to such an extent that you actually can't get it to be disrupted, then you've got a problem, right? So the question is, can we think through, under what conditions are these, norms around gender and roles, are they really salient and are they not, right? So, the kinds of things I was talking about, either in terms of individuals' perspective, abilities and mobility and education, et cetera, or about thinking about kind of encompassing this of these very different, kind of arenas. Then I could start to say, okay, well, I know that, in case A and case B, they don't like the idea that women are going to be out in the public sphere, et cetera. Except for in case A, we've got all of these women who are also highly educated, that there's an entire other set of communities, it's more urban, whatever it is that makes it easier for them to break out, and easier for, often there's like-minded men who are, reticent to say, yes, it's fine for my wife to go out and do this, because they recognize others around them would feel that, but not because they necessarily disagree. So you might have as many like-minded men in both communities, but you have one community where they're not going to encourage her, and another community where they are. So the rung one of the aggregation ladder, right, is to start actually being able to kind of much more precisely think through what are these different sets of contexts, and then refine that. Okay, well, we find out that it's actually not true that mobility, makes them more independent, or there's other factors that do lead to sort of it being much more conducive that these arenas get weakened, right? Or so that it's those, or can we have another intervention that reduces dependence on particular actors, right? So if suddenly, the reason that people are, one reason that they're reticent to do things is because they also desperately rely on them for childcare, for instance, right? Then maybe ironically having, childcare provision is an interesting way of making it easier for you to get the gender quotas and representation to work. Right, so it's thinking about those linkages, but thinking about them in a way that allows us to say, what was the nature of the problem in terms of the rules, and that, the sort of the strength of them over the public individuals. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I wonder if it's just the point where you're like just aggregating the programs by like mechanisms, so like rather than saying like, well, well, maybe putting it hard, it's kind of a set process. But say you want to like reduce local pressure, you could have rules that they encourage like informal accountability in place of the strong solidarity ties. So it's conditional on strong solidarity, like in another place. So essentially, would you just aggregate it by like all these conditionals of like if these situations exist, you like these rather than having like one and aggregate which mentioned what is that?
That's the notion, and the flip side of that, I mean, because you were saying one aggravated intervention in a single country or single context, or you could say, okay, thinking about, if I've made an intervention and it hasn't worked, right, then, being very clear about what were the aspects of the context, right, that in this sort of a framework allows me then to say, okay, well, I think that this is the reason why it didn't work, and therefore in the next, and that's what I mean by the aggregation of knowledge part, right? So you're right. It may be that the result from a programmatic point of view is we need to actually, sort of have a kind of a more variegated program, right? But it also might be that we can learn from mistakes better if it's not just there was something about this context that didn't work and something about that context that did, right? And we start to actually really, kind of specify much more what these aspects of context include. Yeah, let us see.
Well, we've actually hit time anyway. So
Boom.
thank you. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
This is great. Thank you
That's
so
great.
much, Ellen.
Thank you. Yeah.